This man accidentally discovered that it seemed another woman was living in his new home. Not long ago, David had just taken a can of beer from the fridge, when in the next second, a strange woman suddenly appeared before his eyes. The woman was so startled that she panicked, mistaking David for a homeless intruder breaking in.
Okay, you can't live here, because I live here.
Her words left David completely baffled. He had just rented this apartment. So how could it now belong to someone else? While he was still at a loss, Elizabeth hurried to explain that she had already lived here for 5 years, and every furnishing inside had been chosen by her. Johnny had intended to step forward and explain, but when he followed Elizabeth into the kitchen, he was shocked to find there was no one else in the apartment but himself. David then searched every corner of the house, yet failed to find the slightest trace of Elizabeth, so he thought everything that had just happened was nothing more than an alcohol-induced hallucination. Even so, David still added an extra lock to his door that very night. But just as he put the earlier encounter out of his mind, Elizabeth's repeated appearances made David realize this was no illusion. He quickly arranged to meet his friend and told him everything that had just happened. Jack found it all utterly ridiculous, convinced that the strange woman David spoke of was merely an obsession with his late wife. Ever since his wife's passing, David had been living in the past, day after day drowning in that lingering tenderness. Over the past 2 years, Jack had been trying to pull David back from the edge of grief, even introducing him to several great women, but each time David would back out at the crucial moment. With Jack's comfort, David's mind eased a little, yet he still turned to alcohol to numb himself. But this time, even after he finished his shower and wiped the mirror dry, Elizabeth never appeared. Thinking the whole bizarre episode was finally over, he climbed into bed as drowsiness took hold. But just as he was about to drift off to sleep, Elizabeth appeared again, shattering the night's quiet. Seeing that David refused to leave and was sleeping in her bed, Elizabeth was quite helpless. Yet she still patiently proved that she was the rightful owner of the home. The wine stain on the pillow was from when she had accidentally spilled it, and the bed David was lying on was one she had personally bought, with the receipt in the drawer. But when she turned her head, she unexpectedly found that the photo that should have been on the nightstand had vanished without a trace. Elizabeth was displeased, muttering as she walked to the landline phone intending to call the police. Yet no matter how she tried, she couldn't pick up the receiver. The scene left David stunned. Elizabeth tried again, but the result only filled her with fear. She said she would get another phone from the kitchen, but under the moonlight she vanished into thin air. This made David once again doubt whether it had all been just a dream. But the encounter felt so real that he couldn't calm down for a long time. So early the next morning, he hurried to the most famous paranormal bookstore in town, hoping to find answers in a book. David stood before the shelves, unable to decide where to start. At that moment, a store clerk approached, noticing David's confusion, and warmly recommended him several books. By nightfall, David began following the instructions in the books over and over. Yet no matter how hard he tried, Elizabeth never appeared. It was then that he noticed the water glass nearby. Remembering how Elizabeth hated it when he didn't use a coaster, he had no choice but to make one last attempt.
Don't you dare!
Unlike before, David's face now showed more composure. But as the atmosphere grew awkward, he gently began introducing himself to Elizabeth.
Hi, I'm David Abbott. And you are?
Elizabeth was startled by David's sudden move, stepping back repeatedly. It seemed she didn't even know her own name, until she glanced at the glass and finally said her name was Elizabeth. Still, David cautiously told Elizabeth that she might already be dead. Elizabeth was frightened by his words, and as David reached out to comfort her, his hand passed straight through her shoulder. Unfazed, he continued telling her that perhaps it was time for her to move on. Elizabeth denied his claim while backing away, but in the next second her body passed right through the solid dining table.
What's happening to me?
You're dead!
Stop saying that!
Elizabeth was now furious, wanting to teach David a lesson, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't touch him. In the midst of their argument, Elizabeth lunged at David, only to unexpectedly pass through the window and fall outside.
Rest in peace.
Oh, I'm not leaving.
Although Elizabeth eventually accepted the reality of being a spirit, she still refused to give up the apartment. Whenever David watched sports, she would sing loudly to disturb him. Even when David opened the fridge, she would suddenly appear to startle him. Because Elizabeth came and went unpredictably, David even had to shower with his pants on. One day, he finally lost his patience and invited a priest to try to send Elizabeth away, but the priest couldn't even sense her presence. Then he turned to mysterious powers from the east. It wasn't until Daryl from the bookstore arrived that someone finally sensed Elizabeth's presence. Daryl even speculated that Elizabeth might not actually be dead, but that her soul had temporarily left her body. Even more unexpectedly, Daryl discerned that David had a certain connection with another spirit. Daryl's words sent a slight tremor through Elizabeth. It turned out that the reason David avoided the topic was because it was tied to a series of unforgettable losses. She suddenly realized her recklessness, then went up to the rooftop to try to apologize to David. But no matter what she said, David refused to speak with her. And at that moment, Elizabeth also involuntarily voiced her long-held wish. That was to build a secret garden of her own on this rooftop. She didn't know why she was telling David all this, but she still felt that perhaps a heartfelt conversation might bring some comfort to a man who had lost the one he loved. Although David's emotions eased somewhat because of it, he still turned around and left. The night was as thick as ink that could not be dissolved, and his longing for his late wife kept him wandering in this land of sorrow. As the weight of longing grew heavier, he went to a bar, hoping for a moment's relief. But Elizabeth suddenly appeared, blocking his way, and persuaded him not to drown his sorrows in alcohol. David, however, said nothing more and stepped into the bar. Jack was delighted to see David and began introducing him to some of the beautiful women around. Unexpectedly, Elizabeth followed him inside, not wanting David to stay there any longer. But David went ahead and ordered a drink. This instantly angered Elizabeth, and she decided to teach David a lesson. Yet in Jack's eyes, David's evasive movements looked like he was dancing to the beat, making him believe David had finally walked out of his grief. But David's repeated muttering to thin air made him notice something unusual.
Don't you dare! Don't! Last chance!
Then what are you gonna do about it?
Elizabeth had directly possessed David, fighting him for the glass while occasionally slapping him across the face. This drew strange looks from everyone around. Even a friend Jack had invited ended up having a drink thrown on him by David. With no choice, David stumbled out of the bar.
Good God!
You're gonna thank me for that one day.
For what? Make me look like a lunatic in front of all those people?
After uttering harsh words, David walked straight to a park bench without looking back. He thought he had finally escaped Elizabeth, but as soon as he sat down, she appeared out of thin air again. Yet before David's anger subsided, Elizabeth had somehow sunk into a whirlpool of sadness, because she didn't know who she was, nor could she figure out why she had become this half-human, half-spirit form. What broke her heart even more was that, in such a vast world, David was the only one who could see her. Before this, she seemed to have been forgotten in the cracks of time, wandering alone between light and shadow. Seeing the sorrow on Elizabeth's face, David's heart softened. So, the next morning, David began asking the neighbors about any clues to Elizabeth's identity. But to their surprise, none of the 5 households in the building recognized Elizabeth, only knowing that she went out early and came home late, rarely ever returning. With no leads, they decided to go home and discuss the next step. But at that moment, David realized he had locked his keys inside the apartment. Seeing this, Elizabeth calmly guided him to get the spare key from under the fire extinguisher. In the kitchen, they unexpectedly found a receipt from a dry cleaner. Without hesitation, they hurried to the shop. From the owner, they learned that Elizabeth was a very cheerful girl, but she often seemed sad, as if she had always been wrapped in loneliness. Before leaving, David asked to take Elizabeth's coat that she had left there. But the owner explained that the bill was from 3 months ago, and thinking it was unclaimed, he had donated it to a homeless shelter. After that, they aimlessly wandered the streets. All the clues they had could not reveal anything about Elizabeth's past. But just as they passed an upscale restaurant, Elizabeth seemed to remember something. When she stepped inside, she immediately recognized it as the Moose restaurant she had always wanted to visit, but never had the time. Just as Elizabeth was about to leave with a trace of sadness, a man suddenly collapsed behind her, falling unconscious. Seeing the crowd at a loss, Elizabeth seemed to feel something stir inside her.
His chest, check and see if it's bloated.
How would I know?
Just do it!
Following Elizabeth's guidance, David quickly identified the cause, and under the anxious eyes of everyone present, the man was miraculously saved. Elizabeth finally realized that she might be a doctor who saves lives. They then went to the nearest hospital, looking at everything around her, strange yet familiar. Elizabeth's memories slowly returned. She finally remembered that she was the attending physician here, devoting herself day and night to the workbench. This also meant Elizabeth had no time at all for romance. With the help of the medical staff, they found Elizabeth's mentor, Fran, but Fran wanted to confirm David's relationship with Elizabeth. To learn more, David had no choice but to claim that he was Elizabeth's boyfriend.
So, you don't know about the accident?
Accident?
Oh God, David. I remember it. It was awful.
As Fran's words echoed in her ears, Elizabeth's heart felt as if it had been called by something. Guided by this mysterious pull, she came to the ward at the end of the corridor. She gathered her courage and stepped inside, only to find herself lying there. It turned out that Elizabeth was currently in a coma. David followed closely behind and arrived as well. Seeing this, he couldn't help but marvel that Elizabeth was still alive. But as a doctor, Elizabeth also knew she might not have much time left. David suggested that she could try returning to her body. Yet no matter how hard she tried, her soul and body could not connect. Seeing this, David asked Elizabeth to turn around, then he gently took her hand. To their surprise, even in her soul form, Elizabeth could truly feel the warmth of David's touch. Seeing this, David was convinced there must be another way. Just then, Fran entered the room, urging David to leave. Unlike before, this time Elizabeth chose to stay. It was just that, after all these days spent together, they had grown accustomed to each other's presence. Talking about separation now brought an unspeakable reluctance. Afterwards, Elizabeth wandered aimlessly through the hospital, yet no one could sense her existence. She then unintentionally came to her old office, only to find her rival, Brett, had already taken her place. But Brett only cared about leisure, showing no concern for Elizabeth lying comatose, which angered her deeply. It wasn't until she met her sister Abby in the hospital lobby, bringing the children to visit her, that Elizabeth's expression finally showed a hint of relief. Yet she was shocked to find that no matter how the children tugged at her arm, she couldn't feel a thing. Even her dearest sister could not sense her presence. Worse still, Brett told Abby that Elizabeth had no chance of waking up, and the hospital had decided to remove her life support. Before that, they wanted Abby to sign the consent form to give up treatment. Elizabeth was desperate, hoping her sister wouldn't agree, and faced with Brett's endless talk, Abby firmly refused, believing that a miracle would happen, just as if Elizabeth was standing right beside her now. When night fell, David returned alone to the apartment. He looked around the familiar corners, feeling consumed by a faint but overwhelming sense of loss. Hungry, he initially wanted a snack, but after some hesitation, he started frying eggs instead. Facing the now empty apartment, he slowly realized that Elizabeth's presence had allowed him to briefly forget the sadness buried in his heart. But now that Elizabeth was gone, he could only tend to his wounds alone. As David was about to set down his glass, he suddenly seemed to remember something. He got up and fetched a coaster. Perhaps he didn't even know when he had gotten used to Elizabeth being around. Just then, the doorbell rang. David opened the door to find his gorgeous neighbor, Katrina. She came in wanting to get straight to the point, leaving David standing there flustered. It wasn't until Katrina went into the bathroom that David finally let out a sigh of relief. But when he turned around, Elizabeth had unexpectedly returned. Faced with the reality that her oxygen tube was about to be removed, she could only seek out the one person who could see her, David. But just then, Katrina began calling for David from the bedroom. Realizing there was a woman in David's home, Elizabeth felt everything was happening far too quickly. Katrina's clothes were being tossed out of the bedroom one by one, leaving David with no way to explain. Feeling a bit jealous, Elizabeth decided to see exactly what kind of person had come.
Relax. Ooh,
Oh, that's funny.
she's very cultural.
No, you sound jealous.
Please.
You do.
Are you talking to someone?
While they were still arguing, Katrina walked out of the bedroom, confiding in David about her loneliness. Elizabeth then told David not to hesitate, as such a proactive girl was rare to come by. Her words left David a little at a loss. Despite Katrina's clear advances, David followed Elizabeth to the rooftop, and during their talk, he inadvertently revealed his inner affection. Facing the distant sea of twinkling lights, David slowly began to open his heart. His wife's sudden departure had nearly plunged him into an abyss of pain, and that wound had never truly healed. At this moment, the two wandering souls seemed to have found a safe harbor in each other. In the darkness, they drew closer, and the originally faint spark of emotion quietly grew firm and bright. The next day, David took Elizabeth to a manor. Deep within the estate lay a garden, like a scene from a fairy tale dream. It turned out David was a landscape designer. Looking at the strangely familiar scene before her, Elizabeth softly confessed she too had once dreamed of such a beautiful garden. Every contour and the fragrance of the flowers as vivid as yesterday. Just as they were lost in the moment, the real estate agent called at an inopportune time, telling David that the landlord had agreed to the long-term lease. This also meant that Elizabeth's sister had already signed the consent to give up. They quickly drove to Abby's home. David intended to get straight to the point and tell Abby that Elizabeth was right there with them. But just then, Elizabeth's niece suddenly appeared, breaking his train of thought. They had no choice but to sit down and explain things slowly. David lied, saying he was a patient Elizabeth had once treated, but such a lie sounded awkward. At that moment, Elizabeth accidentally noticed that her niece was staring straight at her. Elizabeth wanted to ask her about it, but the girl ran to her bedroom, soon returning with a few cookies and offering one to Elizabeth. David's words also began to shake Abby's resolve. But it was already too late. Unable to bear the financial burden, she had signed the consent form the day before, and the hospital planned to remove Elizabeth's life support at noon the next day. Then David, ignoring Elizabeth's protests, told Abby outright that Elizabeth was right there with them. Hearing this, Abby simply took the children to their bedroom, then grabbed a kitchen knife and tried to drive David away. No matter how much he explained, Abby thought David had lost his mind. After leaving her sister's home, Elizabeth calmly accepted it all. David, however, refused to give up and took Elizabeth to Daryl's bookstore. Daryl immediately sensed Elizabeth's presence.
Yeah, I can tell. In fact, I'm sensing some pretty intense feelings she has for you, bro.
But if I don't have it, how is it that I can see her and talk to her when no one else can?
Exactly.
Exactly what?
That's the right question.
Back at home, Elizabeth and David still couldn't understand what exactly Daryl had meant. Then, in the living room, Elizabeth accidentally found the photo that should have been at the hospital. It turned out David had secretly taken it from the hospital to keep himself from missing her too much. Holding the photo with her sister, Elizabeth's heart finally collapsed. This was the very photo taken when she had failed an important exam. At the time, Elizabeth wanted to retake her studies, but her sister dismissed the idea and took her to a bar to drink instead. It was the first time in her life she had completely failed at something, and she slowly realized that all her time had been devoted to work. Even in the very second before the car accident, she had been thinking about her position as attending physician. It was as if Elizabeth had never truly pursued the desires of her own heart. It turned out that all she wanted at the end of her life was to feel the flutter of love, even if only for a brief moment. So they lay side by side on the bed, gazing quietly into each other's eyes. Although their skin could not touch, their close hands flowed with an indescribable tenderness, as if their souls were silently embracing at that very moment. When the first light of dawn broke, David was awakened by the sunlight streaming in. Seeing that Elizabeth was still there beside him, he resolved to take a brave risk for her. David first coaxed Jack into going to the hospital with him to help. But once they arrived, Jack gradually realized something was wrong. Under Jack's repeated questioning, David had no choice but to confess his entire plan. Yet Jack still thought the whole thing was pure fantasy and refused to believe in Elizabeth's existence.
Elizabeth is standing right behind you right now. She says she knows what a stretch this is for you.
Oh, does she? Okay.
Yes.
Well, if your friend's really behind me, ask what I'm doing with my hand. Rock, paper, or scissors?
Rock.
Rock. Rock again.
He's flipping me off.
Are you flipping her off?
Even if Jack briefly believed Elizabeth existed, he still didn't support David's reckless action, thinking it was too risky and might even ruin David's life. Soon after, they made it to the ward without trouble. But the moment Jack saw Elizabeth's face, he froze on the spot. This woman was the very person he had introduced to David 3 months ago, but she had unfortunately been in a car accident while driving. It all seemed like fate had laid the groundwork long ago, adding a layer of poignancy to this connection. But just as they were about to reach the elevator, they were stopped by a security guard. Jack stepped forward to defuse the situation. Unfortunately, in the commotion, Elizabeth's oxygen tube was pulled out by the guard. In the end, David stopped in his tracks, surrounded by the crowd. Without the oxygen support, Elizabeth's figure began to fade away. At this critical moment, David rushed forward to give Elizabeth mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, only to be blocked by the guard. Elizabeth's figure eventually faded away. Just when it seemed Elizabeth's life would end here, a miracle happened. The previously flat ECG monitor miraculously started beeping. With a soft cough, Elizabeth slowly opened her eyes. Abby was overjoyed. David slowly stepped closer, but Elizabeth seemed not to recognize the man before her. When David reached out to touch her hand, Elizabeth quietly moved it away. The reunion he had longed for never came, leaving only David's lonely figure as he walked away. He went to the bench where they had first opened their hearts to each other, savoring the fading warmth that lingered. The words left unsaid drifted away on the wind. When David passed by the restaurant they once visited, he would stop for a moment. When Daryl spotted Elizabeth outside the window, he greeted her warmly, leaving her puzzled. Next, she moved back into the apartment that was rightfully hers. But as she looked at the familiar corners around her, Elizabeth's heart was full of melancholy. In the sunlight streaming through the window, she happened to notice the faint ring left by a glass on the table. Driven by an inexplicable force, she went to the apartment's rooftop, where a fairy tale dream garden greeted her eyes. David was there, putting the final touches on the garden. Seeing that Elizabeth was now fully recovered, David didn't want to startle her again, so he turned to leave. But Elizabeth seemed to remember something and called out to him.
Wait, the key. I need the key back.
Oh, right.
How do I know you?
Maybe from your dreams.
If you could ever really touch me, away from her. It wasn't a dream.
On that rooftop blooming like paradise, their paths of fate crossed once more. They had never promised each other forever, yet in their most fragile moments they had quietly arrived in each other's lives. She had lain on a cold hospital bed, her soul trapped in a soundless space. He curled up in a lonely corner, drifting apart from this world. But fate made them meet, letting them know and care for each other in the most impossible way. She thought she was nothing more than a shadow, yet in his gaze, she felt warmth again. He thought he had lost the ability to love, yet in her smile, he heard his own heartbeat. They saved each other. Even if the time was short, even if fate was cruel, those days breathing together felt like paradise. Perhaps love was never a carefully arranged formula, but a miracle fate sends at the most unexpected moment.